A formal regulatory document just described XRP not as a speculative token, but as a licensing right embedded in a global settlement system. The Reserve Bank of Australia settled the country's first tokenized government bond on the XRP Ledger, and cross border payments are projected to hit $320 trillion by 2032. If you have been watching the price chart, you have been watching the wrong number. Did you already know that a formal regulatory document described XRP as a licensing right rather than a speculative asset? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now. This is not financial advice. This is for educational and informational purposes only. Do your own research before making any financial decisions. If you find this kind of structural analysis useful, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach more people who need to see this. Now, let me walk you through exactly what happened and what it means for the thesis you have been holding. The phrase most people following this space have read straight past is in a formal regulatory analysis. The document states that the XRP token embodies, in effect, a licensing right for the Ripple transactional system, not a security, not a share of Ripple's profits, not a debt instrument, a licensing right. To understand why that distinction matters, you need to understand what those three categories actually mean and why the document was so precise about which ones do and do not apply. When you own stock in a company, you hold equity, fractional ownership of the enterprise itself. If the company earns profits and distributes them, equity gives you a proportional share. If the company is acquired or dissolved, equity holds a legal claim on what remains. Equity is ownership. When you hold a bond, you hold debt. The issuer owes you money. There is a repayment schedule, an interest rate, a legal obligation on the issuer's balance sheet. Debt is a claim on future payment. The regulatory analysis removed both categories explicitly. It stated that unlike a stock offering, XRP does not provide a share of the profits earned by Ripple, nor does XRP entitle the holder to any payments by Ripple the way debt would. What XRP entitles the holder to is the token itself, which is integral to executing transactions on the Ripple settlement network. The document continued. To the extent the Ripple network is successful, XRP should increase in value because the full functionality of the system requires the token. A licensing right is access to a system that cannot function without the license in place. Think of how enterprise software licensing works inside large institutions. When a technology company licenses critical infrastructure to thousands of banks or financial firms, those entities pay for the right to use a system they cannot replicate on their own. The license is not a bet on the licensor's stock price. It is a structural dependency. The value of the license is tied to the scale and adoption of the system it enables, not to what anyone believes about it on a given day. That distinction matters most for someone thinking about a long-term position rather than a short-term trade. A speculative asset has value based on sentiment, what people believe about it at any given moment. A licensing right has value based on what the system it enables actually does. The connection between the system and the key is structural, not psychological. That is a fundamentally different kind of asset to hold through volatility. Because once you understand that XRP is the operational key a system requires to function, not a bet on whether people will believe in it, you stop interpreting volatility the way everyone else does. You start reading it differently. There is a second dimension to the licensing right that makes the economics here structurally different from ordinary asset pricing. When XRP functions as the liquidity key for a network used by 1,000 institutions, the depth required is set by the volume those institutions collectively process. When the network scales to 10,000 institutions operating simultaneously, the required depth scales with it. Unlike equity, whose price is driven by earnings multiples and market sentiment, the licensing right for a settlement system has a structural floor. Whatever depth is required for the system to execute its full transaction volume without creating a bottleneck. That floor rises as the system scales. This is not a prediction. It is how settlement liquidity works as a mathematical constraint. Now, let me explain on demand liquidity because the two concepts only make full sense together. On demand liquidity is the specific payment mechanism Ripple built to allow banks and financial institutions to move value across currencies and borders in real time without the pre funded accounts that make the current correspondent banking system expensive and slow. Pre-funding is the structural requirement that defines the current system. When a bank in one country needs to deliver a payment to a recipient in another, the traditional infrastructure requires that bank to maintain pools of local currency sitting in the destination country in advance. These pre-funded pools exist across dozens or hundreds of countries for any major international bank. The capital inside them is not actively deployed. It waits, earning minimal return, serving only as the delivery vehicle for the next transfer. The scale of capital locked in this arrangement globally is significant by any measure. On demand liquidity removes that pre funding requirement entirely. The sending institution converts local currency to XRP at the moment of the transaction. XRP travels across the network in 3 to 5 seconds. The receiving institution converts XRP back to local currency on arrival. No pre funded pool required, no idle capital, no correspondent banking intermediary collecting a fee at every step. The math is where most coverage stops short. A Ripple computer engineer and banking systems analyst who worked inside multiple major banks ran the arithmetic on what this mechanism requires to function at institutional scale. If a single bank executes one transfer of $200 billion and XRP is priced at $20 at the time, that single transfer requires 10 billion XRP. The current circulating supply is 61 billion. One transaction consumes more than 16% of all available supply at once. Now scale that across the global banking network. 13,000 banks using this system simultaneously in real time. Settlement speed does not resolve a liquidity depth problem. A fast pipeline can only move as much volume as its capacity allows. If the total simultaneous transaction demand exceeds the available depth in the liquidity pool, slippage occurs. Transactions execute at prices that deviate from the intended rate because there is not enough depth to absorb the full volume. The system does not back up because the technology is slow. It backs up because the available supply at the current price is insufficient to carry the volume. The math has a structural resolution, and that resolution is not speculation. It is the requirement the system places on the asset if global institutional adoption is the destination. Now, let me show you what the Q1 2026 data actually says, because this is where the picture stops being theoretical. Daily transactions on the XRP Ledger increased 35.3% in Q1, reaching 2.48 million transactions per day. Current activity on a working infrastructure. The tokenized real-world asset market on the XRP Ledger grew 124% in the quarter, reaching $2.25 billion. Tokenization is the process of representing a real-world asset, a government bond, a piece of real estate, a fund share as a digital token on a blockchain. It allows those assets to settle in seconds rather than days, trade around the clock, and move across borders without correspondent banking delays. That growth rate in a single quarter placed the XRP Ledger fourth among all blockchain networks globally for tokenized real-world assets. Ethereum, which has historically held the lead in this category, is losing ground. Ripple's RLUSD stablecoin expanded 45% in Q1 to $340 million and has since grown to $613 million, making it the largest stablecoin on the XRP Ledger. A stablecoin grows when more participants need the system it enables to function. Every dollar in RLUSD is a dollar that entered the XRP ecosystem for a transactional purpose. The XRP exchange supply ratio stands at 0.03. Less than 3% of circulating supply is available on exchanges. The NVT metric, which compares market capitalization to on-chain transaction volume, dropped 23.73. When NVT falls, network activity is growing faster than current valuation reflects. Less available supply combined with more on-chain activity is the opposite of what stagnation looks like. 7-spot XRP ETFs are approved and operating in the United States. Combined ETF holdings reached 904 million XRP, approaching 1 billion tokens held inside regulated financial products. During the same period when Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs saw combined outflows of approximately $2 billion, XRP ETF products recorded $35 million in inflows. Institutional capital was being repositioned. The direction of those flows is a stated decision by fund managers operating under fiduciary responsibilities, not casual retail movement. Now, let me bring in Australia because this is the development that most coverage treated as a footnote and should have treated as a headline. The Reserve Bank of Australia is not a startup. Ripple, alongside Zero Hash and Chainlink Labs, completed Project Acacia, a research initiative led by the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Digital Finance Cooperative Research Centre. The project demonstrated that Australian dollars can power 24/7 settlement of tokenized Commonwealth Government Treasury instruments, sovereign debt, settled in real time around the clock on the XRP Ledger. The Reserve Bank of Australia committed institutional credibility to this demonstration. The conclusion of Project Acacia was not that this infrastructure might work someday. The conclusion was that it works. The integration included Chainlink's CCIP, the Cross-Chain Interoperability Protocol. CCIP is the system that allows different blockchains and traditional financial databases to exchange information with each other, while satisfying the governance and compliance requirements that institutions require before allowing real capital to move. It is the governed messaging layer between the old financial plumbing and the new one. The XRP Ledger's EVM sidechain, a programmable environment within the ledger that supports smart contracts and complex transaction logic, hosted the settlement records, the token rules, and the execution logic. Together, these components deliver governed asset movement, regulatory enforcement, and unified liquidity in a single integrated architecture. Imagine someone who has spent 30 or more years building a diversified financial position, equities across multiple sectors, bonds from different issuers, real estate, retirement accounts. Each of these positions currently lives in a disconnected institutional silo. Each settles on its own timeline with its own custodian, its own processing schedule. The infrastructure that moves capital between these positions and across borders is slow by design, layered with intermediaries, and expensive at every step. The connection between Chainlink's interoperability layer and the XRP Ledger is the structural foundation for a system that operates across all of those asset categories simultaneously, in real time, 24 hours a day. The Australia settlement was not a theoretical argument for what this infrastructure could do. It settled sovereign government bonds on a live infrastructure during a period when traditional bond settlement would have been unavailable. One development in this ecosystem has gone largely undiscussed in mainstream coverage. Flare, a network built specifically to expand XRP's utility as a financial instrument, has constructed a mechanism that allows XRP to be used as collateral in lending protocols, enabling yield generation without requiring the holder to liquidate the underlying position. Hugo Fillion, the head of Flare, described this directly. Flare's mission has been to turn XRP into a collateral asset rather than just a transaction payment asset. The mechanism works by wrapping XRP into a form that can participate in decentralized lending markets, where it can be borrowed against to generate stable asset positions deployed into yield bearing arrangements. XRP is gaining the properties of a collateral instrument within a growing financial infrastructure. The Bank of International Settlements, the coordinating institution for global monetary policy between the world's central banks, projects that cross-border payment volume will reach $320 trillion by 2032. The addressable market is not a projection invented by an enthusiast. It comes from the institution that coordinates global monetary policy across central banks. Now, let me pull all of this together. For the first time, a formal regulatory analysis established XRP's structural identity, a licensing right in the Ripple transactional system, not equity, not debt. The operational key the settlement mechanism requires to function, with a value tied directly to the scale of the system it enables. A banking systems analyst with direct experience inside major financial institutions ran the liquidity arithmetic at global scale. A single transfer of $200 billion at $20 per XRP requires 10 billion tokens from a circulating supply of 61 billion. 13,000 banks using the system simultaneously would generate liquidity demand the current price structure cannot absorb without bottleneck. The math is not a prediction. It is a description of what the system structurally requires. Q1 2026 produced this: 35.3% more daily transactions reaching 2.48 million per day. Tokenized real-world assets up 124% to $2.25 billion, fourth globally. RLUSD at $613 million and the network's largest stablecoin. Exchange supply at 0.03. NVT declining. ETF holdings at 904 million XRP with inflows coming in, while Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs were recording outflows. None of these developed in isolation. The Reserve Bank of Australia completed the country's first sovereign government bond settlement on this infrastructure. Chainlink's cross-chain interoperability protocol connected the compliance layer between the old financial system and the new one. The Bank of International Settlements framed the global addressable market at $320 trillion by 2032. Researchers and institutional analysts have identified XRP alongside XLM, HBAR, and LINK as infrastructure components for the new global settlement layer, a structural designation based on institutional adoption, regulatory frameworks, and technical integration. The pattern across all of these data points is not accidental. It is the result of years of institutional framework building, legal, technical, and financial, running in parallel with the public-facing conversations about price and volatility. The people who spent that time understanding the structure rather than watching the chart are arriving at a very different conclusion about what they are positioned in. The licensing right framing gives something specific to a person who has been patient through the uncertainty and the skepticism of the people around them. You are not holding a position waiting for the crowd to change its mind. You are holding the operational key to a system that, if deployed at global institutional scale, requires that key to function. That changes how you interpret volatility. It changes what patience means in this context. It changes what you are actually measuring. One analyst described the coming moment as the first utility cycle, the first time the global network turns on simultaneously for real institutions moving real capital, not a demonstration. The actual deployment of infrastructure assembled over years across jurisdictions in partnership with central banks. Most of the people in your life are watching the price number. You now understand what generates that number, what the structural math requires, and how far along the construction of the system behind it has come. After everything we covered today, what is the single piece of this picture that was entirely new to you? Was it the licensing right framing from the regulatory document, the Australia settlement, the liquidity math at global scale? Drop it in the comments below. I am genuinely curious what part of this story the people around you have not heard. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening, go ahead and like it. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Share this with someone in your circle who is only following domestic crypto news and has no idea what is happening globally. The infrastructure settled Australian government bonds. The question now is what happens when it runs at full capacity for the first time with real institutions, real capital, and no off switch, and whether you understand what you are holding when that moment arrives. Stay informed, stay positioned. I will see you in the next video.